Welcome to the DSM Webinar Series. It's a pleasure to have all of you in here today. My name is Altos Passos. I work for DSM, and I will be with you during this webinar. If you have any questions or comments during the presentation, you can please add it to the chat that you can see in the main screen of this presentation. A little introduction before we start the main talk. The swine production is basically a system converting grains and cereals into pork. And the personnel involved in this business are always looking for ways to make it more efficient by managing the costs, feed, and genetic, mitigating the losses, and driving the production system to a higher production of pork. But what are the main challenges of the swine production system that limits its efficiency? A survey done in a conference 3 years ago indicated to us that the post-weaning diarrhea are the most important issue that the swine farms are facing. Also, another survey done in 2015 indicated to us that organic acids are the most important eubiotics utilized in the swine industry, trying to improve the gastrointestinal functionality. A quick search done in PubMed indicated to us that organic acids are the category of eubiotics with the biggest number of publications compared to other eubiotics. But of course, there's also data being published with combinations of those feed additives and also combinations with other ingredients. And to share some of those concepts with us today regarding gastrointestinal functionality and feed additives in swine nutrition, we invited Dr. Maria Walsh. Dr. Walsh is the Global Innovation Leader of DSM. She holds a PhD from Purdue University, and she has a strong experience in swine research. Dr. Walsh, welcome to this webinar, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Adsos. Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here. So today I'm going to talk about optimizing gastrointestinal functionality through nutrition. So a brief overview of the topics that I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to start off by asking the question, why is the health of the gut so important, and how does it change during the production cycle? And then the bulk of my talk is going to focus on nutritional approaches that benefit the health of the gut, and we're going to focus on three main areas. So we're going to talk about how to strengthen the gut barrier, building disease resistance through optimized immunity, and also how do we modulate the microbiome. So in terms of pig production, there are a couple of big trends globally that are influencing how we're producing our pigs today. So the biggest driver is really around the threat of antibiotic resistance, and this is forcing us to no longer use in-feed antibiotics. There's also some newer legislation appearing on some of the other tools that we've used in the past, such as therapeutic levels of zinc oxide. So that will now be banned in Europe from 2022. Another big focus area influencing how we produce swine is the impact on the environment. So that's another key area that we have to look for and bear in mind in the future. And all of these things are happening while disease is really on the forefront of many producers' minds right now. We know what's happening in the world around ASF, and that's just one example of the many diseases that are threatening how we produce our swine today. So there's a real need for solutions that are more sustainable. So developing technologies that will be available to use for a long time to come and not be withdrawn after a certain period of time. So as Adsos mentioned, that, these production challenges that affect our pigs, a lot of them start in the gut. So we see in the nursery period, almost 3/4 of the disease is actually enteric disease. And then in older pigs, it's still very prevalent, right? So over 50% of the challenges, it all starts in the gut. And some of these main causative agents include, for younger pigs, things like the pathogen E. coli, so enteric toxigenic E. coli, different types of salmonella, also rotavirus can be a big issue. And then in slightly older pigs, we have things like Brachyspira and Larsonia responsible for swine dysentery and ileitis. Now, these are all big challenges. But we know in order to optimize health and performance of our pigs, we really need to focus on the health of the gut. But when we think about gut health, I'm sure if I asked 10 different people, they'd all have 10 different answers. So what we've tried to do at DSM is to define what that is so that we can measure it and we can develop solutions to improve it. And we've defined it as a steady state where the microbiome and the intestinal tract exist in this happy equilibrium whereby the welfare and the performance of the animal is not constrained by anything that's happening in the gut. There's a number of different components that need to work together to make this happen. So that includes what we feed the animal, how well it's absorbed, digested and absorbed, how well the microbiome are working together, the health of the intestine, how well the immune system is functioning. All of these need to work together to benefit the performance of the animal, also the welfare and reduce environmental impact. So if we take it just a quick look or a deep look at the gut, we'll see it's a very complex organ because it has two main roles to play. So it is the main barrier between the external environment and the host itself, or the pig. But the really interesting thing is it's only one cell thick because it has these dual roles around nutrient absorption and fluid uptake, but also defense. It needs to be very strong and to fight against any potential infection there. Now, another key consideration when we talk about gut health is the microbiome. And the microbiome is not just about bacteria, actually. There's lots of things in there, such as fungi and protozoa and viruses and so on. But what happens during normal production is there's periods where there's changes in production that can influence the stability of this microbiome. So things like weaning is probably the biggest impactful event in the pig's life, but also things like feed transitions and mixing, and when pigs are going to market, so removing some of those pigs, all of those things can cause stress to the microbiome. So just kind of briefly giving an overview of what it looks through the production stages. So during lactation, it's dominated by a milk-orientated microbiome, so lots of lactic acid bacteria, and it's quite a healthy microbiome at that point. That all changes once the pig is weaned and that milk is removed, and now they have to survive or thrive on a more solid feed. But this causes a huge amount of turbulence in the microbiome until it starts to reestablish, and you get the growth of opportunistic gram-negative bacteria at this point. After that happens, we see sort of a shift between the aerobic to anaerobic bacteria, and we have things like Clostridium and Bacteroides coming in. But as the pig gets older, it's really all about fiber fermentation and the ability of the pig to extract as much nutrients and as much energy from the fiber as possible. And that is now we know that's highly correlated to production efficiency. So I mentioned that weaning is probably the most profound effect on gastrointestinal functionality in the life cycle of the pig. And it's, when you think about how pigs are actually supposed to be weaned during nature, this is a really prolonged process. It's usually about 4 to 5 months. But now in conventional production, everything happens in a day. So it's a big change. They've changed from a milk-based diet to now proteins in the form of cereals that they're not used to. They haven't got the machinery essentially to digest them. There's a lot of other stressors, so they're removed from the sow, they're mixed with a lot of other pigs, a lot of social stress. Oftentimes they don't even know where to get their food from, so there's a period of food withdrawal. And this is all happening at a time where the pig is actually quite immunocompromised. It hasn't developed its own active immunity yet, let alone a lot of these digestive enzymes. So this is a really critical period that we have to pay attention to. And this will determine almost the lifetime performance of these pigs. So tackling these post-weaning challenges, it's getting more difficult because a lot of the tools that we've relied on in the past are no longer available to us, or will no longer be available to us in the near future. So we have to think about what's more sustainable. And there's a long list of different types of additives that can be put in feed and water that can tackle some of these issues. So that's where I'm going to focus a little bit of my attention now today, is talk about nutritional strategies and how these can impact the health of the gut. So we're going to start by looking specifically at the gut barrier and how can we essentially feed the gut to support it. So I mentioned weaning is a very critical period in the pig's life. So at weaning, there's a huge amount of restructuring happening within the gut. So pre-weaning, you'll recognize these nice long villi, a lot of a nice absorptive area for absorbing nutrients. But once the pigs are weaned, this all changes. And that's usually down to a period of feed withdrawal. So we get a lot of blunting of villi and villus atrophy, and that absorptive capacity is reduced. Along with that, the barrier function is often compromised, and there's some data there showing that, in fact, weaning results a lot of the time in a leakier gut. So things like mannitol, which is a large molecular weight protein, can actually permeate through the gut easier. And also the electrical resistance. So often we use TER to measure the strength of the gut and the strength of those tight junctions. And if you see a drop in TER, you know your barrier function is being compromised. So how do we go around tackling some of these issues? Well, it's really kind of trying to develop a mindset around not just feeding the pig, but feeding the gut as well. So the gut has preferences for the type of energy that it likes. So the main energy sources are glucose, glutamine, butyrate, and ketones. And depending on what part of the tract you're talking about, they also have different preferences. So for instance, the colonocytes in the large intestine prefer butyrate, and then ketone bodies are something that the pig survives on during periods of feed withdrawal or starvation. Another key feature of the gut barrier is the mucus layer, and this lines the epithelial cells, and it acts as a really good physical barrier against pathogens from binding to the epithelial cells. Now, this mucus layer is made up of mucins, and these mucin proteins are composed of a number of different amino acids. And the main amino acid, which is important when we talk about mucin, is threonine. So if there is a lack of threonine, this is really going to compromise the strength or the strength of the gut, really, and that mucus layer. Another really important amino acid is cytosine, and this is a precursor for glutathione. Now, glutathione is the main endogenous antioxidant within the gut, and it's responsible for the detoxification of reactive oxygen species. Now, these are pretty critical because they can cause all kinds of damage to cells and cause lipid peroxidation, and cells of all types, right? So immune cells and intestinal cells. So it's important that we keep these reactive oxygen species under control, and we rely on key antioxidants to do that. But we have to build them. So if there's not enough amino acids there to do that, again, we're going to have lower levels, and this is going to be an issue. So as I said, low concentrations of these key nutrients in the diet can put pressure on the structure and function of the gastrointestinal tract. And one strategy to reduce endogenous losses of some of these critical amino acids is through the use of exogenous enzymes. So this is some work that was done with phytase, which shows that it reduces endogenous losses. So it reduces total amino acid flow by 21%, and also has some direct effects on particular amino acids. So it doesn't affect all amino acids equally. So some are more saved than others. So things like cysteine and glycine and threonine in particular. So using phytase, you'll end up losing less of these particular amino acids, which of course is really important for the barrier function. So then just to kind of sum up this little section, really, it's all about feeding the gut, not only just feeding the pig for performance, but supplying the appropriate nutrition to the gut, and not just the right types, but also the right amounts. and thinking about how can we improve digestion of the feed that we're giving our pigs and making sure they're getting all the right nutrients from it, and reducing endogenous losses. And that's where enzymes can play a role. And also important to consider that the requirements for some of these amino acids and other nutrients will increase when there is an immune challenge. Okay, so moving on to the next section that I wanted to talk about today, which is around building disease resistance through optimized immunity. So just to kind of recap a little bit on the immune status of the pig at weaning or early in its life, it's very much dependent on passive immunity from the sow. So all of those immunoglobulins that it gets from the colostrum. It also has its own innate immune system once it's born, it starts to develop that. Now, this type of immunity is non-specific. It's that first line of defense. It's very rapid, but from an energetic perspective, it's very expensive. And we need to think about that when we talk about the immune system, because if the immune system is overactivated or not working correctly, it will actually detract a lot of energy away from growth. So it'll essentially, it acts like an energy suck. So energy that could otherwise be used and other nutrients could be used for growth and protein, of course, it won't be used. It'll go into the immune system. So the pig is very reliant on that earlier on. And then the adaptive immunity, which is the antibodies and the B and T cells, that only starts to develop from around 2 to 3 weeks onwards and is not fully functional until around 6 weeks of age. This type of immunity is very, very specific. It's very potent. It does require priming, so it needs to see antigens in order to react to them. So it's a little bit slow, but it remembers. If it's seen it before, it'll come back very strong the next time round. Now, the problem with this immune development is there is a window of susceptibility where passive immunity has declined, active hasn't kicked off yet. And this is right around the time of weaning. So these pigs are somewhat immune compromised at this point. Now, we can't talk about the immune system without talking about the mucosal immune system, because essentially 60 or 70% of all the immune cells in the body are located in the gut. And, given that this is the interface between the outside environment, it's no surprise that there will be a lot of immune cells there. Now, they really need to be able to defend the animal from any particular risk in terms of pathogens, but also needs to not be overreactive to things that aren't a huge threat. So there needs to be a tolerance element to the immune system within the gut as well. So the mucosal immune system, I call it the ultimate multitasker, because it really needs to be able to distinguish between low-risk antigens, such as you would find in feed, and the normal residents of the gut, so the normal commensal bacteria, and then the big threats like pathogens. It needs to be able to tell the difference between the two and react accordingly. And we call that sort of, in an ideal situation, we would have this homeostatic balance where there's a good level of activation when it's needed, but then when it's not needed, tolerance kind of dampens down the immune system and it doesn't start reacting to everything. Now, the problem with the young pig is that tolerance doesn't develop until they're around 8 weeks old. So right around the time of weaning, there's a lot of activation happening and not a lot of dampening down. So again, we have to think about ways of not activating or overactivating the immune system, because then again, that results in inflammation, destruction of the barrier function. And again, this is going to impact the performance of the pig quite a lot. There is the other flip side as well. So if there's too much tolerance and not enough activation, you get immunosuppression. So ideally, we want to have a good handle on both sides of the immune system to keep everything working correctly. So what happens at weaning, again, from an immunological perspective, there's a lot of protective factors within the sow's milk. And once they're weaned, they don't have access to this anymore. And the immune system is seeing a lot of new antigens for the first time coming in feed. Also, I mentioned there's a lot of microbiome shifts at weaning. And every time the microbiome shifts, all of those immune cells, or quite a good chunk of them in the gut, they're constantly, looking for changes or kind of sensing changes within the gut. And they will react when there is a lot of turbulence. And this creates the opportunity when there is that turbulence for pathogens to take hold. And together with that social stress, there's an impact on the redox system as well. So when we think about how do we, from a nutritional perspective, support the immune system, we got to start with the basics. So that's, really getting basic nutrition correct. So balanced nutrition is the prerequisite for maintaining good health status. So we need to make sure all the nutrients that the animal needs are present. So that's the first step. From there, we also need to think about, is there any nutritional factors that the pig is seeing for the first time that we can try and mitigate? So there's a couple of things I just wanted to mention. So one was around soybean. So there's a couple of the storage proteins, so the conglycin and the beta-conglycin, they're known to be quite immunoreactive. So that may be something to consider. How do we prevent them from being too reactive to the immune system? So data has shown that if they're heat treated or a protease is applied, or a combination of both actually, is the most effective in terms of promoting the growth of pigs in that early post-weaning period. Another nutrient I wanted to mention briefly is fiber. So we know that, first of all, not all fiber is the same. So it's a bit of a general term, but what I really am referring to here is soluble fiber. So the types of fiber that cause viscosity. So this again can have an impact on the intestine because it tends to promote the growth of pathogenic bacteria, and it also interferes with digestion of some of the nutrients. So breaking down that fiber with something like a Xylenes will also help to improve the level of fermentation that's happening. And then the final one I wanted to talk about briefly is phytate. So this, as we know, phytate phosphorus can chelate certain minerals and affect protein digestion. So breaking that down with phytase is also a good idea. So now thinking a bit more specifically about the immune system and how can we support the immune system with nutrition, we have to think about it in a multi-component approach. And we've created this sort of three-prong approach where we think about, first of all, supporting activation of innate immune cells, so antibacterial activity of phagocytes. The second one is promoting cell proliferation, so important to have these immune cells and enough of them when we need them. And then the third piece is around supporting cell protection from oxidative stress. So starting off with the first one, in terms of the activation piece, so there's evidence from the literature and from our own research that certain eubiotics have the ability to have immunomodulatory effects. So things like yeast cell wall, certain algae, certain probiotics and phytobiotics can have a direct effect on the immune system. And activation of the innate immune system can help animals defend themselves against infection during periods of stress. And this is just some work that we did ourselves looking at the activation of macrophages. So these macrophages were taken from pigs, and then we incubated them with yeast cell wall, and there was a significant increase in oxidative bursts, which is how these macrophages are activated. So it shows that the yeast cell wall is able to activate them. The second piece I wanted to talk about is around enhancement of immune cell proliferation. Now, we know one particular vitamin is very effective at immune modulation, and that's vitamin D3, and in particular, the hydroxylated form of vitamin D3. Now, there's particularly in these times of COVID, I think vitamin D has really come to the forefront, and it's not just about supporting skeletal development now. The role of this vitamin in the immune system is really being emphasized. And this work is looking at comparing different levels of vitamin D. So in the control, there was only 1,500. And then in the other two treatments, there was higher levels. And then we compared just using higher levels of vitamin D versus having a good chunk of that being hydroxylated. So we can see improvements in the number of immune cells, so leukocytes in the blood, the viability and also the activity of these when you increase the amount of vitamin D. But when most of that is coming from the metabolite of vitamin D3, the 25-hydroxy vitamin D3, that in itself is also improving the activation of these cells. And vitamin D3 has been proven also to have not just effects on the immune system, but that's been translated into performance benefits in pigs. So this is some work that was done evaluating the effect of vitamin 3 on pigs that were challenged with rotavirus. And they found that feeding high levels, so 500 IU of vitamin D3, improved fecal consistency score and decreased intestinal damage when compared to control and those receiving the lower levels of vitamin D3. So it was quite effective. The last piece I wanted to talk about in relation to the immune system is around this antioxidant role in protection and cell communication. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about vitamin E. This is a very potent antioxidant. And we know from our research that it's just very critical in order to ensure good vitamin E status in post-weaned pigs, that it's all about the sow and how much vitamin E these pigs are getting through the sow's milk. So it's really critical to think not just about the piglet and how much is in their feed, but how much is in the sow's feed as well. And this work, I think, really emphasizes this in relation to not only vitamin levels, but also and the antioxidant status. So they fed 2 levels of vitamin E to the sows, so either 44 units or 250. And then they measured the blood levels of various different endpoints in the piglets, right? So not in the sow, in the piglet. And they saw increases in the vitamin E status, but also significant increases in immunoglobulins, total antioxidant capacity, and catalase, which is another important antioxidant. So again, really critical in periods of stress, making sure that those pigs have all of these particular vitamins that are going to have protective effects on the immune system and allow it to function optimally. So I talked about a couple of these different vitamins in isolation, but it's all about synergies and packaging them together. So we've just recently done a bit of more work on this area, and it's quite interesting, the results that we saw. So we conducted some work where we had a stress model in weaned pigs, and we looked at various elements of the immune system. So phagocytosis, which is activation of the innate immune system, and also oxidative burst. And we had a 2x2 factorial where we had a standard diet, and then we had our immunity solution, which was a package of various vitamins and eubiotics. And we found that when the pigs were stressed, that when the immunity solution was present, that the level of phagocytosis went up, which is a positive thing. So these innate immune cells are becoming more active. And then in terms of oxidative burst, when pigs were stressed and there was no immunity solution, there was a dip in this oxidative burst, which again is an important, we want this to be as high as possible. So having this dip is not going to be beneficial to the animal. But when there was some level of immune support in there, we didn't see this dip. We also looked at the performance of these pigs, and these were relatively healthy pigs. And we fed 2 levels of this solution, so standard level and also high level. And we were able to pick up performance benefits in these pigs. They were performing quite well anyways, but we were able to pick up around a 5% improvement with the lower inclusion level, and they were around 1 kilo heavier coming out of the nursery. So that was a good outcome in terms of putting all of these components together and getting a response. Now, the final piece that I wanted to talk to you today about is modulating the microbiome. So we've talked a lot already about weaning and how critical this is to the health of the gut and all things happening in the gut. But we know if you look at the microbiome, this period of weaning is the most profound effect on the bacteria. So what happens is, as I mentioned, when the pig is in its lactation period, there's a lot of lactic acid producing bacteria. And these are the ones that we know as mostly probiotic, right? So they're very healthy bacteria to have within the gastrointestinal tract. But almost overnight, they drop once that milk is removed. And you can see that very clearly here. So from day 10 of age to day 21 where they're weaned. So the lactobacilliaceae, they literally just hit the floor. Now that's not very good because it creates opportunity and instability within the microbiome, opportunity for other bacteria to fill its space. So you get a loss of this diversity, and we know that loss of diversity is not a good thing because, as I said, it provides this opportunity for pathogenic bacteria to grow. I really like this particular schematic. I think it shows very well, you know, we start with symbiosis when the pig is on sow's milk. The microbiota, you know, it's quite diverse, it's quite stable, things are going well, and then you have the weaning transition and everything starts to change. So the feed changes, there's stress, and the bacteria start to change. And oftentimes you start to get this intestinal dysbiosis, so the bacteria start to get out of balance, you get more of the non-beneficials because there's opportunity for them to jump into that space, and you know, there's still quite a lot of oxygen in that environment, and gram negatives will jump in there, take the space, and then proliferate, and you end up with a situation where now you've got post-weaning diarrhea as a result that needs treatment. Now, the main causative agent a lot of the time for this post-weaning diarrhea is enterotoxigenic E. coli. It's responsible for 50% of piglet deaths worldwide. And this is just some work that we did ourselves with a challenge strain of, we used F18. And you can see, so we challenged on day 0, and within 3 days we were getting, you know, full on diarrhea in the pigs that were challenged. And what happens is the heat labile toxin causes secretion of fluid into the lumen. And then ETEC also disrupts that tight junction, causing the intestine to become leaky. Now, another factor that can also make this situation worse is fiber. And again, I'm going to refer back to the soluble fiber that I talked about earlier on. And this is, I think, a nice example to prove that point. So in the study, they looked at how ETEC, or hemorrhagic E. coli, or hemolytic, I should say, E. coli, how its growth was affected by a certain substrate. And the substrate here were different types of ingredients that were chosen based on how much soluble NSP, or non-starch polysaccharide, was present. So what they found was the ingredients that have more soluble NSPs, the bacteria were able to grow much more on that. So we saw something like guargum up here had the highest level of ETEC. Now, what they did find as well, if you have something like pearl barley and you add a carbohydrates to it, you're able to reduce the amount of ETEC. So again, by breaking up some of this fiber, decreasing the viscosity, you can also influence the amount of the pathogen that can grow. So then thinking about what's the best approach to tackling this challenge, so, you know, how to reduce this post-weaning colibacillosis, I think about it in 3 ways. And the first is really around pH. What can we do to create an environment that's less attractive to something like E. coli to proliferate? How can we increase diversity? Again, kind of trying to squeeze out the ETEC and have a more diverse and stable microbiome. And then the third is tackling the pathogen itself. And is there something we can feed that has antibacterial effects? So starting with the intestinal pH, we know that acidification is very effective here. And this is some work with benzoic acid. And it has a very clear effect on reducing allele pH and diarrhea as a result. In terms of increasing microbial diversity, then something like a probiotic, in this case, from this study, they showed that Enterococcus faecium was able to, after 2 weeks, increase microbial diversity. And then finally, something like an essential oil, many of them have been shown to be efficacious against ETEC and at relatively low levels. So having the right combination of essential oil is another way of tackling specifically that pathogen. So enteric challenges, they're complex, and we all know there's no silver bullet to any of these. So it's all about finding the right combination that works for you and your challenge. In our research, we've seen a lot of synergy with the combination of essential oils and benzoic acid together. We've seen improvements, and not only in performance, but we've seen changes, particularly in how the microbiome is functioning. So this is some some data from looking at the functions of the microbiome as opposed to just the bacteria, but what are they doing? And we see some upregulation in some of the core metabolism around carbon and nitrogen. So essentially these bacteria are better able to extract energy from the diet that the pig is being fed. And we know now, when we start to understand the microbiome more, now that we have more advanced tools such as functional metagenomics, we understand how important this whole carbohydrate metabolism is. And this is related to the production of butyrate and pyruvate. And we know that this really is the key to driving efficiency in pigs. So this work was done where they looked at the pathways within the microbiome, and they compared pigs that were really efficient and those that were not very efficient at all. And they were able to draw some conclusions from that. And it really hinged around carbohydrate metabolism, how effective they were at being able to ferment that carbohydrate in the hindgut and produce those short-chain fatty acids, which are very, very effective, not only from an energy source, but from a health perspective as well. And the other part of this was around nitrogen metabolism. So seeing less of that amino acid metabolism and more of the carbohydrate metabolism. And that is really the type of profile you want in the microbiome to support efficiency in pigs. So how can we, from a nutritional perspective, kind of help the microbiome achieve that endpoint? And one way to do that is around the use of carbohydrates such as Xylenes, which are well documented to be able to break down a lot of this arabinoxylan that we find in wheat and some in corn as well. Because the smaller the subunits of this arabinoxylan is, the better the beneficial fiber fermenters are able to degrade it and produce these short-chain fatty acids that will promote health and performance in the pigs. And this has, very profound effects not only on the performance but on the health of the gut. So this is some work where they looked at different levels of Xylenes and how that impacted the architecture within the gut. And so they found it wasn't a linear effect, but up to 1,000 units of this particular enzyme, they saw improvements in the villus to crypt depth ratio. And they were also able to pick up differences within the cecum in terms of how much of these key short-chain fatty acids were being produced. So they saw increases in butyrate, which is as I said earlier on, key energy source for the colonocytes, but also has key anti-inflammatory effects within the gut as well. And then propionic acid, which is a key energy source. So that brings me to my last slide. So I just wanted to sum up some of the key points from my presentation. And, when we think about gut health, it can be quite a complex topic, right? So I think, for me, it's all around starting with the gut and developing that as soon as possible and maintaining the barrier strength as soon as possible. We also have to think about the immune system. How can we optimize how that functions? Because we know it's not fully developed in this big stress period post-weaning. So anything we can remove from the diet that would agitate the immune system, we should do that. And then think about fine-tuning the immune system so that it works well when we need it, but it's not overreactive when we don't need it, because it's a huge, it will draw energy away from growth, right? It will prevent those pigs from growing if it's using too much energy. Then we need to set the microbiome up for success. We now know that, the activity within the microbiome, particularly around carbohydrate fermentation, is one of the key factors in efficiency, particularly as the pigs get older. So how can we help them achieve that endpoint? And then knowing that there is no silver bullet, we have to understand the situation we're dealing with and think about how do we tackle that with the many additives that are available to us. And hopefully then we'll move from being kind of a black box, a mystery box of what do we do, to being more precise in terms of our approach to support gut health. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for the presentation. Now we go to the Q&A section. If you have any question, please, you can add it to the chat then we'll try to address your question. We have some questions. Actually, we have a lot of questions already in the chat. Coming to you, Maria. I'll address the first one. The non-use of antimicrobials in pigs would increase the pathogenic bacteria in the intestine. How do you see this topic in the future?
How do I see this topic in the future? So I think, we're always going to have some level of challenge. I think there's many strategies we can take. So, it's not all about the feed either, right? We have to think about biosecurity and some of these other key factors in terms of the health of the pig and how much challenge it faces. But I think we have to realize that antibiotics are not going to be there for us in the future, and how do we move forward without them? So I think we need to take a holistic approach. So improving biosecurity and also thinking about feed strategies to create an environment where these particular pathogens can't take hold. And that's going back to some of the things that I talked around microbial diversity and looking for solutions that are specific to the pathogens that we're coming up against, to kind of make sure that they don't take hold, and we end up with post-weaning diarrhea and obviously impacting the overall performance of the pig. So I think there's a couple of different ways that we can approach it, but again, we don't have a one fixes all solution like we do with antibiotics. There's many considerations that we have to take into account.
Thank you, Maria. And also considering that we see some countries already moving to restrictions on zinc oxide and copper sulfate in pharmacological levels, then would you make the same considerations for these two ingredients, if you could say like that?
Yeah, so, that's going to be in Europe now come June 2022. Zinc oxide will no longer be able to be used in that high level. And I think when antibiotics weren't available in Europe anymore, or at least in feed antibiotics, zinc oxide was highly relied on, and it has come to be part of the normal strategy. So there's a lot of research now focusing on ways to overcome that. And I think, as you mentioned earlier on in your presentation, that acidification has really come to the forefront here in terms of a really impactful strategy to overcome some of these challenges. And we see a lot of use of that, particularly in Europe. But there's also, a need to be a bit more precise in how we deal with some of these bigger pathogens. So the likes of ETEC, there's a lot of research going on right now to develop solutions that are specifically targeting these particular pathogens, and through feed application or feed feed strategies, because we need to get a bit more precise about our approach, So I think the solutions will come for sure, and they'll be a bit more precise in terms of the targets.
Thank you, Maria. One more question, more or less related to this topic. In what percentage should there be beneficial or harmful bacteria in the intestine of the pig? Maybe the balance, right? The balance between...
Yeah, so I think it's that's a really interesting question, because I think you'll never have an environment in any, be it the gut or any other microbiome environment where it's all just good bacteria. That's not how it works. And depending on you have like the pathogens who are always going to be pathogens, but they have to get to a certain number before they become, before they really cause trouble. And sometimes that's only a low level, or sometimes it can be a higher level. And then you have what we call the opportunistic pathogens who may be there all the time, and conditions aren't quite right for them to take hold. And that's okay, as long as you can keep everything else stable. They won't cause you problems. They're still there, but they won't cause problems. So it's about, and we know from microbiome research that it's all about diversity. Having a lot of diversity within the microbiome, that creates stability, and stability is a good thing when we talk about the microbiome. So we have issues when we change things, you know, because we're basically signaling the immune system something is changing. And that happens when we, you know, with feed and with mixing and things like that. So it's all about trying to keep things stable and not trying to eradicate what we call the pathogens or the opportunistic pathogens, but to keep them at low levels where they're not causing problems.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And then maybe one more question that can add up to the previous ones. Any considerations regarding the gut villi atrophy after the weaning?
Yeah, there's a lot of research been done with that one over the years. And, you know, I always think of John Plusky's work on this and how pivotal that was. And it's all really around feed withdrawal, because those poor pigs, you know, they've been used to knowing where the milk comes from. And then suddenly you put them in a pen with all their, you know, all these other pigs, and suddenly there's no sow. So it can take them a little while to find that feed trough. And that's the trouble there. If there's a couple of days where they're not eating, that's going to have a huge effect on the gut. So, you know, the key is get your pigs eating as soon as possible. And whether that's, you know, turkey feeders or whatever it is, help them find the feed, make it as accessible as possible. And I think that will help a lot in terms of that villus atrophy, because that's, you know, once that happens, it's, you know, they're always going to be lagging behind a little bit. So if we can prevent it, that's going to be really beneficial to the pig. So, you know, make the food attractive, make sure they know where it is, and they have, you know, they can get to it, and they can eat enough, but not too much as well. I guess that's the other thing. Sometimes they overdo it. So yeah, I think that's probably the critical point there.
Yeah, thank you. Now, changing a little bit the topic, the question is about combinations of enzymes. You mentioned something about Xylenes and also phytase. How about the combinations? Any consideration regarding the combinations of enzymes and how that can work in the gastrointestinal environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll remember back, you know, when I talked about that young pig and when they moved on to that solid feed, they really haven't developed their own enzymatic capacity straight away. So they can benefit from having some help from enzymes. And, you know, we do try to overcome that by feeding them very highly digestible protein at that point, you know, earlier on. But a little bit of help from enzymes, I think, is a good idea. You know, things like Xylenes and amylase, a protease combination, I think have been quite effective in young pigs, depending on what diets they're being fed. But I know there's definitely some regions in particular who have been very successful with that combination in young pigs. Now, whether you have to feed it for the whole nursery period, maybe not, but it does help to tackle some of that nutritional diarrhea that you see, where there's, you know, too much protein ending up in the hindgut and fermentation happening there. So if you can improve that digestion earlier on, that can help to prevent some of that.
Good. Maybe moving a little bit to feed intake. In your opinion, the creep feeding could enhance the gut development?
So I think there has been evidence to show that creep feeding will help to smooth that transition. And again, it's all around, because oftentimes they're not eating a huge amount, but they're getting a little bit used to the idea of solid food. So it makes that transition a little bit smoother. And that's probably where the benefit comes from, as opposed to the, the volume of feed or the nutrition from the food, but it's more around that behavior, so that they, there's not 3 days without feed if they've had some creep before.
And thinking a little bit earlier, gestation and lactation. Do you think that carbohydrates would affect positively the microbiome of the sows and also affect the piglets?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. From my own experience, I've done a little bit of work with carbohydrates in sows, and we have seen some benefits in terms of the the body condition score of the sows. So, you know, they've been able to, I guess, maintain their body condition through that end of sort of gestation, lactation period. And obviously that helps with subsequent reproductive performance. So that's probably the key benefit. And you see that as well, you know, with some improvements in terms of milk yield and litter, you know, overall litter weight as well. So I think there is something there, you know, obviously you're trying to get as much feed into that sow during the lactation period as possible and get the most from it. So as I said, in my own experience, I've had some positive responses with feeding Xylenes to sows.
Good, thank you, Maria. And also thinking about protease, would you add up some other considerations regarding protease and soybean meal inclusion in the early nursery period?
Yeah, so I think, you know, diets can be, earlier on we tend to feed highly digestible, probably more expensive diets, and we know the soybean can be an immuno trigger to pigs. So having something to mitigate that risk, like a protease, can maybe help us get a little bit more soybean into those pigs a little bit earlier and help with the whole feed cost strategy. I think that's one positive approach from having a protease in a nursery pig diet.
Yeah, and maybe one more question, also moving a little bit to water-soluble solutions. Do you think that in this early nursery period, water-soluble solutions can support also a better intestinal health or a better functionality, if I could say like that? Definitely.
I actually did some work during my master's on acids through water. And you know, we know, right, pigs, they'll drink water at least before they eat food. So I think acids through water was highly effective because not only are they getting it into their body quicker, but it was also, you know, they like to play with the water nipples, right? So it's almost disinfecting the pen as well. So you get a 2-for-1 in that terms. But that was highly effective in terms of promoting gut health and getting it into the pigs sooner, in my experience. But there, you know, there's other things you can put in through water, and the nice thing about water is you can pulse it in and out. You know, you're not dependent on having it in the feed, or if it's not there, waiting till the next phase or batch to include it. So you have a little bit more flexibility, which is attractive, I think.
Good, thank you. And maybe one last question before we finish. Regarding the oxidation, do you really know the requirements for vitamin C and maybe vitamin E to promote a proper level to improve the gastrointestinal functionality of the young piglets?
Yep, so that's a good question. And I don't think there's a magic number there, to be honest. I think it really depends on your pigs and what kind of health status they have and how much they will benefit from inclusions of vitamin E and C. I think they will benefit from having adequate levels. You know, in our research, we've seen, particularly with vitamin C, you know, up to sort of 100 IU of vitamin C. And then on the vitamin E side, we have done quite a bit of work on the immune side more recently with that. And we've seen some nice responses between sort of the 150 and 200 range. But again, I think it's more in the range. There's not a magic number for everybody's going to maybe be a little bit different. But I think there is value, particularly during those stressful periods in the pig's life, when we know their status is going to be pretty low, because, you know, I talked about vitamin E, it's all down to, you know, their status is dependent on what's coming from the milk, right? If it's a good level coming from the milk, then they might be in a good situation. But we know a lot of the time, you know, pigs around the world, they're fairly deficient in vitamin E and C post-weaning. So I think they could benefit from having a little bit higher levels than maybe normal.
Okay. Thank you again. Well, we are going to the end of the time, and we had a great discussion, in my opinion. I'd like to thank Dr. Walsh for his great presentation, and thanks to the audience for joining us today. It was a great discussion, a great presentation, and I just ask, please, to everyone to answer the survey after the presentation. This survey will help us to improve the next webinar. And well, thanks again. I hope to see you in the next DSM webinar, and goodbye.